how do you look at the current state of geopolitics?
We have two wars going on right now. The war in Russia-Ukraine. We have the war in Gaza-Israel. We've coming to the end of 2023. I think it's the warmest year on record in terms of climate temperatures. We have tens of millions of migrants moving around the world. And of course, this was the year where generative AI made its appearance. We don't know really where that's going to go.
There is a slight change of power between US and China. So now I would want to talk to you about the recent bilateral meet that happened between President Biden and Mr. Xi.
Right. I think that there is a way to think about US-China relations as a managed competition.
Right. Welcome, viewers. Welcome to this special edition of the Geointerview. Now, today, we have with us Mr. Joe Rosenthal, who is the president of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. With a particular focus on US foreign policy, issues of war and peace, and human rights, he is also a scholar and a teacher. Now, today with him, we will be discussing the state of the geopolitics in the 21st century. Welcome, Mr. Joel. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Delighted to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Amazing, sir. We're grateful for this opportunity. Now, sir, before we come on to the agenda of this interview, I would want to ask you, how do you look at the current state of geopolitics in the world, given that there are wars going, there's an intense power struggle between America and China. So, and given you're also the president for a council that works on ethics. So given that context and background, how do you look at the current state of geopolitics?
Well, thanks. Yes, it's definitely a time of turmoil, for sure. And I would agree with President Biden, who talks about an inflection point in history and in world politics. We have two wars going on right now. The war in Russia-Ukraine. We have the war in Gaza-Israel. We've coming to the end of 2023. I think it's the warmest year on record in terms of climate temperatures. We have tens of millions of migrants moving around the world. And of course, this was the year where generative AI made its appearance. We don't know really where that's going to go. So I think it's accurate to see, yes, in a time of turmoil, some transition and perhaps an inflection point. And just to sort of fill that in as well, I think you can see a couple of important factors to help us understand the world we're looking at. One is an ideological struggle. Again, going back to President Biden's view, we have open societies, democracies, in some conflict with autocracies or closed societies. And this is not just an international struggle, an international relations question. It's also an internal challenge for democracies, sort of rise of populism and illiberalism. And then we have, of course, a changing balance of power. The United States, in some ways, is receding. It's sort of coming into a period of recalibrating its commitments. China is certainly ascending. We have the so-called BRICS countries, right? The sort of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, right? The so-called global South, definitely ascending from a geopolitical point of view, and a question of what role these countries will play. So I see it as a lot of challenges here, but there are a lot of great opportunities as well.
All right, sir. Now, one of the things that you did talk about just right now was that how there's this struggle for power, be it the ideological struggle or let's just say the real power. Now, with that thing in context, and given, I would want to ask you, how much do you think ethics form a part of the international relations as of now? And I also ask you that because in what ways does your council, look at the happenings, and how do you assess them and, work to address these issues? again, it's also a sort of popular notion that how geopolitics is, just a struggle for power. So with all of that, how would you say, or how much would you say ethics are a part of our current reality?
Sure. Well, I would agree that geopolitics is a struggle for power. I think we have to understand what we're looking at from a realist perspective. We have different countries with different interests who are challenged to pursue those interests, and those interests often conflict. And I think we have to understand that. But I think without understanding an ethical dimension or from a political science point of view, a normative dimension, what are the rules, what are the norms, what are the standards by which we have the sort of transactions internationally, that we miss something. So from Carnegie Council's point of view, we want to see the world from a realist point of view, but also understand that ethical dimension and the moral dimension. So I think from my point of view, I start with the idea that we can't really understand interests unless we understand values as well. We cannot separate the two. They go together. When we talk about interests, interests are comprised of, they're made up of a set of values, a hierarchy of values. So that would be step one, to understand interests in light of values. Again, understanding these, there's a sort of competition within that framework, but that's an important one. So what does this mean in terms of what we see in international relations? Well, let's just take an issue like climate, right? So this is a shared challenge. It's a global scale challenge. And there is both a common interest globally in dealing with this issue, and then there are national interests. And so how do we navigate that process? So what are we looking at now? Well, we have, for example, the Paris Agreement is the most recent international sort of agreement on how we're to deal with climate. And that creates a framework. It's both a realist framework, but there's also a normative framework, an ethical framework about responsibilities. And now we see downstream from Paris, one example, last year at COP27, we had the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, right? So this is creating the opportunity for and a responsibility of the sort of wealthier nations to create a fund for those who have been harmed by environmental damage as we move forward. This is just an incremental step. It's one area, but just to show you the idea of responsibility is an important one. So, or we could look at the wars now in the Middle East and also in Eastern Europe, the whole idea of war crimes, right? So there's a great debate over this now, what constitutes a war crime. But my position on this would be the fact that we even have the Geneva Conventions, we have international humanitarian law, the international law of armed conflict. These are really important points of reference by which we can have a debate over what these principles are, what they mean, how they're being applied, who's accountable. So these are really important sort of dimensions of international politics that can be missed if we look at it as only a struggle for power without considering the sort of ethical dimension.
Sir, I love the notion where, you highlighted how interests which we see, something that are there for like seeking power, they're also at the back end defined or influenced a lot by the values, right? Now, because we're talking about the normative aspect of the international relations, it would kind of be an injustice on my part if I do not pose this question to you. Is and again, I pose this question to you as given a specialist or a scholar who really knows about the ethical ideas in the international relations. So the question is that when we look at the public view or the general public, or their viewpoint in the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, people almost find themselves torn apart ideologically or ethically, on which side to take, because it seems to us, let's just say to a rational mind, that both sides have, I wouldn't say Hamas, but let's just say Palestine and Israel, both sides have
Mhm.
certain aspects wherein, like, you feel like, you're ethically, you should be supporting them. But then again, there's a very strong divide on this issue. So as someone, who knows about the ethicality of geopolitics, what is your view on it? And, how do you see this war panning out?
Right. I think the cardinal principle and cardinal rule, if you will, as I look at this conflict, is to remind ourselves of our common humanity. So what does this mean on the ground? It means the protection of innocent people. So if we want to go back to the beginning of the current conflict, you did leave Hamas out on the side, and I think that's important because it begins, at least this cycle begins with a terrorist event, the deliberate killing of innocent people and also taking of hostage and so on. So, I think that, that's just a place to sort of become grounded, that the deliberate killing and capture of innocent people is wrong. And again, this has different elements to it, but again, the sort of deliberate nature of it and the cruelty of it, I think needs to be marked at the beginning. Where do we go? I think it's important for a constituency of people, and this would be those who would be promoting a two-state solution, to be resolute in putting forward a notion of mutual recognition, reciprocity, as a sort of a basis for moving forward. This has become lost over time, and we see this in the cycles because the extremes seem to drive the conflict. But I think this is a moment for those who oppose both extremes to sort of be resolute in sort of charting a course for what a realist would call a kind of a modus vivendi, which is, a way of coexisting. And I think the path forward doesn't necessarily have to be sort of this notion of reconciliation where everybody becomes friends, if you will. It's a question of how to live together separately, I think, to begin, right? How to negotiate this sort of two-state solution where the sort of aspirations of both communities can be fulfilled, and then we can work on sort of comity and amity and other things, further down the line. So that's kind of how I see it at the moment. But you're right; it's a very inflamed. We're right in the middle of a terrible cycle of violence, and we have to find a way to end that.
Certainly, sir. And that is exactly, what I was, when I asked you this question, that is something that I was looking for, is not, I would say something like a scholarly view, but then, you really went in personal, and I wanted to know because given, again, we're young people, so sometimes we, really wonder, okay, what do specialists are thinking about? Like someone who has skin in the game, how do they, or how would you see the conflict that is going on now? So are you
Yeah, I
seeing?
think that just one thing, you talk about just sort of generational difference too. I mean, one thing just to keep in mind that, cycles of violence do end. It is possible. We could even think about, the end of World War II, right? That, the idea that the European nations would come to an end of their intra-European conflict, right, was sort of unimaginable in the middle of the 20th century. And then here we are, we have a peaceful Europe. And you can see, again, the Cold War, right? The whole idea that sort of structure of that sort of bipolar balance of terror, right? That would somehow, and I understand we're in a new cycle now, but it's not the same as it was then, that the Cold War did end, entering into a new cycle. So I do think it's important, particularly for young people, to to understand that. It's not predetermined, and it's not fated to be some endless cycle of conflict, that conflicts can and do end.
So one of the things, the fact that you even said that the cycle or this vicious cycle of violence can even end, it almost struck me in a sense that, how much, even though it seems how rare it seems as a possibility, but the fact that you highlighted it and gave the example of the Second World War, then it seems to me that, we can hold this, I don't know, as a North Star, something that even this vicious cycle of violence can really end. The World War ended, so this can, you know, I think this is a really powerful idea of the time, and something that we might also, I don't know, pin on the title of this video or quote you on,
Well, I
as a,
think that's right. I've thought a lot about that too, and you can talk about how wars end. It's a big topic. Um, but I think that the notion of a magnanimous peace, right? The idea, rather than a punitive peace, right? I think it's something to think about other historical examples of when a war ends, whether there's a winner or a loser, or there's some kind of stalemate, right? How does each side treat each other, right? So there's a couple of scenarios here, both in Europe and in the Middle East, of sort of a cold peace, or something, perhaps, warmer, if you will. So anyway, but there are some models to think about in terms of getting to a negotiated settlement, and then what happens after that.
so bringing this conversation from here to what we talked about at the start of the conversation, right, where you mentioned how there is a slight change of power between US and China. So now I would want to talk to you about the recent bilateral meet that happened between President Biden and Mr. Xi at the Asia Pacific. Now, in the meeting, or certainly I would say within the media, it seemed that it's Mr. Xi who, I wouldn't say came to Mr. Biden, but one of the purpose of Mr. Xi towards President Biden was to kind of ease the tensions that have heightened between the two countries, especially around the technological embargo that US has placed on China. So how do you look at the recent bilateral meet with them, and how do you assess that the two parties are going on from here?
Right. I think that there is a way to think about U.S.-China relations as a managed competition, right? So there is a competition, but it doesn't necessarily need to lead to conflict. And how do we go about doing that? Again, there are good models of great power relations, that can address this issue of a managed competition. Again, using Betko, if you want to use the Cold War as an analogy, there was a long period in the middle of the Cold War, if you're looking at the United States and the Soviet Union, of détente, right? This was a managed competition, but a lot of agreements were reached. There were arms control agreements, the anti-ballistic missile treaties. There were test ban treaties. There were great concern about the use of nuclear weapons or potential use of nuclear weapons. There was a treaty about outer space, right, to demilitarize space as a potential theater of war. Later on, you have the Helsinki Accords, which dealt with conventional capabilities, but also issues, really sensitive issues like human rights. So I think there is a benchmark for, again, a kind of a managed competition in a great power rivalry with genuine security concerns. And so I'd like to see more sort of in that line, where we can have some agreements in some ways about the competition itself. One of my concerns is that there are just sort of growing sort of theaters of competition. Technology is a good one, right? So there's an area to try to get out in front of it, because it's becoming seen as an area of security concern, right? Cyber war, these kinds of things. And so, to the extent that competition can be managed through conversation, dialogue, and even agreement, I think that would be a good thing. And this is the time to do it.
All right, so given that you talked about, the competition, especially in the technological front, one of the very popular thing among the youth when it comes to geopolitics is this control over AI, right? With the likes of Chat GPT or Sam Altman. There's this really, people are wondering, okay, does China also have their version of an artificial general intelligence? So this is something that I think we're really excited to looking forward. Okay, how does it really pan out? Now, sir, could you also give us an idea about the Carnegie Council, of which, or Carnegie Council for Ethics, of which you're the president? That what it, I mean, just a quick uh, answer from what does the council focuses upon on a day-to-day basis, and what is it that you and your institution is trying to achieve?
Great. No, thank you for that question. So, we are looking at global scale issues that have moral and ethical dimension to them, which also require new ways of thinking about governance, right? So, how are we going to deal with climate, right, as an urgent, existential, global scale threat that affects everybody locally, right? Or another, some people feel AI is in that area, right? We have this emerging technology. It's being unleashed into the world basically as an ungoverned technology. What should be the rules, the norms, the standards for the use of this technology, and how will it be governed? We see the migration crisis as well. I mean, massive movements of displaced people, and we do have a sort of a broken global system for the management of this challenge, right? So how do we coordinate that? I mean, those would be three of the sort of frontline issues that we're dealing with here, and our role is to provide ideas, to provide thought leadership around how to address these issues, both at the national level, but also at the international level, and how to foster some degree of international cooperation, given all the differences that we recognize. We want to form a community of people like we're doing here. I hope your listeners and readers and viewers, I think what we are doing, just this conversation, sharing ideas, sharing experiences, and creating a community of people who are thinking about these issues, working on these issues, writing about these issues, teaching these issues, right? So there's something very powerful about creating a community, and the fact that we have now, digital technology and real time, the ability to have this conversation. We really want to leverage that. It's only a generation ago where you'd have to get on an airplane and to do this kind of work. So we've really leaned into sort of digital technology and virtual meetings to do that sort of thing. And then finally is to provide serious intellectual resources and educational opportunities for people like you and people like those who will be listening to this podcast to be able to draw upon, right? So we've already talked about different points of view from around the world. We've talked about history. We've talked about philosophy, right? So we want to create this sort of toolbox, if you will, of educational resources that people can use.
So you highlighted the importance of the technology in that we are able to have this conversation, and earlier how it used to take a plane to fly across. But I do hope that someday we can, our team and you can sit across the room, right, and then again record another conversation on the role of ideas and the international politics. But having said that, one of the pointers that you highlighted that, and this is going to be a prelude to the last question that I would be posing to you, right? So one of the pointers that you highlighted that the council really focuses upon is a climate change, right? And now again, climate change policies across the world, there's a lot of, I would say, diverse ideas on how to be working around that. So my question to you would be just what is your view on, now when you say environment, you talk about the COP meetings, right? And one is just around the corner. So how do you look at the COP happening in UAE and what sort of expectations do you have from there?
I think in general, the way I think about climate is that it is both a universal and a particular challenge, right? So we have to recognize it. I think that every person should understand that it is the sort of defining issue of our common experience of living now in this time in this on this planet, right? So it's something we all have. But I also think that at, at the same time, we have to be able to be thinking about our particular, even local circumstance, right? So what does it mean, whether you're in a city or you're in a country or wherever you are, and so somehow to sort of make that connection between the global and the local. And I do think that the challenge, and this is why it's such a hard problem from a policy perspective and a governance perspective, is that change has to happen locally, right? And then it has to be scaled up, right? So how do we do that? It's very hard. It's like a bottom up as opposed to top down. So I think both things need to happen, and hopefully they drive each other in some way. But again, that this is why it's a particularly difficult problem, and why I think it's important for organizations like ours to work on it is, I think one of the first steps has to be the way people think, just the way they understand, like that they have to be, what is the human relationship to the natural world, right? And to have some basic awareness of that, and at the level of conscience and responsibility and that sort of thing. So, I mean, that's a little bit high-minded, but I think it's important because without that, very difficult to make progress. And then again, we have to have this coordinating mechanism because people's local circumstances are very, very different. So how do we sort of coordinate this whole process?
So one of the key takeaways that I would have with this answer of yours is number one is how needs to be this attention on human relationships, something that really does not get talked about that often these days. But again, given you're someone who is who really analyzes the role of ideas, I think this is something that we should really focus upon. And the other thing is how you highlighted, even though climate change is a global problem, but it has local effects on every one of us now. So having talked about uh, geopolitics, climate, and attention on human relationships, now what the last question would is not about all of these things, but it is about you, right? So I would say you've had quite a significant and long career as of now, and given we young people were very much interested into, we would if you could just tell us what has been your experience like working in the field of international relations, and what sort of advice or lessons would you want to give us, the young people?
Well, thank you for that question. It's important. I think that from an ethics perspective, um, it's important for individuals to think about. You use the term North Star, right? Like what are your formative principles, and to be reflective about it, and then open but deliberate about sort of fostering those principles. What are the principles that are important to you, and to think about where they come from, your formation, be reflective about that, your experience, your intellectual formation, and to commit to that, but understanding that those principles will be tested as you move through the world, and that the story is likely to be one of trade-offs and challenges in sort of applying these principles, and to be open to that, which leads to the next point, which is empathy. It gets back to what you were talking about, the personal. You need to be able to understand the world through the eyes of other people. This is critical. This is extremely difficult, and maybe not always completely possible. But this is why philosophy is important, history is important, literature is important. It gives you the sort of the means by which to try to perceive the world as others might perceive it. I think this is really critical. And then the last point, and this is, by the way, why the personal is so important too, right? That sort of exchange of ideas and experiences, I think, is just, you can't, you really can't replace that. And then the last thing I think is really important as well is humility. It goes with empathy, I think, but that there are limits to what we can accomplish, limits to what we can understand, limits to, the sort of purity of our position. We may think we're right, but there are some limits to that. And that's always a very hard one virtue, but I think it's something to keep in mind always. I think you can be a committed person and a principled person and a humble person. I think those things, it is possible to do that. It's not always easy. The last thing I would say, just from my experience here at Carnegie Council, has been the opportunity to speak with people who have firsthand experience. Right? It's one thing to study, to do research, to master a field of learning intellectually, but I've learned to really respect those who have actually worked on a problem, right? Whether it's in diplomacy or in military operations, or as a journalist, or as a relief worker, or AI tech engineer, somebody who's actually sort of working practically on some challenge, right? And to think about how the world looks from their point of view, what they're trying to accomplish, what they've seen, what they've heard, what they've learned. I find that really, really important if we're talking about sort of applied ethics, public policy, and how we're going to sort of organize around these challenges and to try to create a better outcome. We have to respect the experience of those who are actually working the problems.
Well, sir, that's been a wonderful conversation, ranging around all sorts of ideas. And given that at the last you highlighted about all these things, like, the morality on the certain cardinal principles that, we can hold ourselves accountable for. What I can promise you from our end is that as an institution, right, or as an organization of the young people, GEOSTRATA will certainly, be we have been, and we'll try to double down on, these north star or the cardinal principles as we talked about. So at the end of it, sir, from behalf of the whole team and the organization, we would want to present you our deepest gratitude. And let's just hope, not hope, but, let's just, again, sit around someday soon and have a conversation on different aspects of international relations.
That's great. I think the work you're doing is very important. We're happy to help anytime along the way. And I hope maybe we can greet you in New York sometime.
Yes, likewise, sir. I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day ahead.
Great. Thank you.
Yes.